nomenclature. There's an idea behind every day, and I think today is a really interesting day of this sort of idea of the generalist as specialist, or this idea of a kind of past, present, and future, and how we're looking broadly at things. And Orit's got a career of really exploring that understanding of ecologies from a distance in some levels, and seeing things from outside as well as inside, and understanding how things might work on a complex level. And she's senior lecturer at Regent University in strategic and complex design, is that the right title? And the connection between sort of understanding how things operate. And we were talking earlier about this idea of being the expert of the generalist. You know, is it possible? How can you understand that? And it's very much about understanding how things work, predicting things, understanding the complexities, but engaging with the process as well. So you have to connect with it. There's an interesting point of practice there as well, and how you actually start to do it. So I'm going to be really fascinated about seeing where the various ways of understanding those complexities are. We were both very pleased as well because we realised the future is orange. It's a joint thing. We seem to both gone yellow and orangey, sort of gold today. So there's obviously something in that.
Sunshine, so.
Yeah, exactly. We're opening the curtains from this side. So without further ado, I present to you Orit.
Thank you. So I'm going to take you from a fascinating, inspiring exploration into design and architecture into talking about economics. And people, of course, hate economics. But I'm not talking about the boring kind of equilibriums and you know, annoying formulas that seem completely irrelevant to our lives, but actually to real economics, the ones we live through, and all the decisions we want to make, and you know, thinking about your next paycheck, thinking about where you build your career, thinking about how you know, take care of your family, etc., etc. All the mundane stuff of, you know, live, work, love, hope, that is really the essence of everyday life. And it is also the essence of the environment in which we all operate. And many times we kind of put aside the mundane side that make up the environment in which you actually design operations and try to create real impact. Just a few things about myself and how I kind of got into this world as well as into others. I started working in business and in market research, working for Gallup, and getting really, really bored. So kind of the old style of data analytics generation ago. And then I went back to academia, and one of my students at some point was working for the Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, and he was managing a lot of stuff around the peace negotiations. And we got to talk a lot because he never showed up for class, and he never handed in his work. So we kind of built this rapport, and at some point when we met after he finished his studies, he asked if I wanted to come in and work at this really fascinating NGO, which nobody knew about, but that was really doing all the back channel negotiations. So it was a kind of safe space where everyone had kind of plausible deniability to explore ideas that in formal times they wouldn't want to be seen as even considering for political reasons. So basically the way it worked is that everyone in the game was operating through this hub informally and then creating formal materials that were there handed over to all of the teams. So I started by it was a very small operation. It was like, 12 people. I was starting with the economic file, so looking at the economic side of the peace agreement, and then refugee file. And then at some point, there was some really serious discussion about putting an international military force on the ground. And I was taking the lead on that and got into a lot of the military side of things, looking at different international interventions across the world, going to Kosovo, going to other places, looking at how these things kind of work. Of course, it was a very frustrating process where you do have so many players operating in such a complex environment. And we actually talked about it last night. Israel is a really small place. So if you find yourself in a position that is actually part of the work being done, like the general's course or others, you actually have access to all the decision makers. It's all there, and as an observer, you can actually see how in real life so many of those players, diplomatics, politicians, leaders, military, other defense organizations, all try to make sense of this complex environment. And from my observations, there were two very important elements. One was that each of them saw the system completely differently. And rightfully so, because from their perspective, the system was different. So when you live in a conflict environment, and I think that relates to other environments as well, there's a kind of multiverse. And understanding how the system is actually constructed from your own perspective is the most important thing there is, because you're there as an operative. So there is no one shared reality or one shared system. What are the tools that allow people to actually make sense of that system and find the leverages and build their own strategies within that? The other thing was that I noticed that most of these players were mainly focused on, all the other sharks and dolphins swimming around, depending on how they would define them. They were not paying attention enough to the water. And the water quality was shifting around us. And very slowly it was becoming more acidic, and it was, developing a whole new range of life forms. And they were under the radar. And at a certain tipping point, they completely changed that ecology. And if they were able to kind of anticipate and notice these emergences that, Afra was talking about, they could have, done a much better job both for themselves and for that peace environment in general. Anyway, I was doing that for 3 years, and then Afra invited me into the OTRI to add a bit of the economic political side into what they were doing. So I had this amazing opportunity to sit with her and Shimon and the other people in the team for 2 years and really explore how design thinking and how this new form of approaching military operations can completely change the game in so many fronts. So that was also part of the journey. As you know, there was a purge. OTRI was shut at some point, rehabilitated later on, but that was the end of it. So I actually moved to London 11 years ago, and I was trying to carry a lot of that understanding in terms of how people make sense of complex environments and what allows them actually to identify leverages and operate better within those environments, which is taking us to complexity economics today, because I think that the real essence around complexity is not just understanding that the world is complex. Yeah, we know it's complex, but what do you actually do about it, and how do you actually utilize understanding of complexity to create more effectiveness? And there's been so much talk over the last 2 days, very interestingly, about creativity and about the need to think in innovative ways and having this whole design mindset. But so much about design is the materials you get to play with. So if you're playing with sugar, you might create something completely different than, if you're giving sheets of paper or sheets of metal or cookie dough. So by actually being exposed to new materials, you can actually be much more creative and much more innovative and kind of discover new dimensions in which you can play and operate that you weren't aware of before. So I think that part of the education around design thinking is also exposing your students to more materials to play with. Because once they have that intuitive thought, whatever problem that you throw at them or whatever situation you ask them to explore, this will enable them to think in new terms and come up with better, more effective solutions that have kind of multidimensional effects. So that is the idea. So just a few words again. I know you're all familiar with complexity theories, but just generally to remind you of a few main points. Everything around us, from fashion trends to wars, emerged through a complex process whereby you have loads of individuals, each doing their own thing. Out of these accumulated actions, certain regularities begin to emerge, and some of these regularities converge to create certain systemic structures. Of course, once these systemic structures actually emerge, they go back and create incentives and constraints on what people can actually do. So we have this ongoing feedback effect. And what is interesting about that is when you think about any phenomena, it is being recreated daily by the activities of everyone that is involved in that ecology. It's not something that has been created and it's fixed and it's in some point of equilibrium or resting state until you go and you change it. It is being actively recreated. Now, it is being actively recreated, but it's not replicated. So every day, while it is being recreated, it also shifts and it also evolves. So any phenomena socially, both positive and negative, is like this storm moving, over the ocean and kind of recreating and pushing more energy into it until at some point it hits land or runs out of energy. But it is a recreated element, and complexity theories, which is, wide kind of umbrella into a lot of different theories, is all about understanding what exactly is happening in between the micro and the macro. What are the dynamics that actually allow us to understand this process better? Now, specifically, when we're talking about the economic side of it, complexity economics is really interesting because it takes these ideas of looking into the inner dynamics that help us to create and understand the emergence process of systems very differently from traditional economics. So first of all, again, it is an ecological approach. There is an assumption that you don't move into equilibriums. Systems continue to evolve. So it's not that there is this kind of resting place that you get to. Also, the system is endogenously driven. So shifts are happening from within the system. You don't need external shocks for a system to change route. It assumes non-rationality. It doesn't mean that people are irrational. It just means that they are non-rational, and I'll explain that in a bit. And of course, it assumes that everything is network-driven. So underneath any ecology is really a network of people. A city is really just a manifestation of a certain network and certain constellation of people and how they operate. So in that sense, because we're looking at economics from an ecological and natural point of view, economies emerge spontaneously everywhere. You don't need to actively develop them. And you would find them in, the harshest types of situations. This is a picture of a stall in Kibera, which is a slum in Kenya. I think it's the biggest urban slum in Africa. And, when you look at it from the outside, when you look at it from the perspective of an aid organization or development organization, you said there's nothing there, right? You have people living in absolute misery. Most of them are unemployed. Very high levels of crime and bad health situations, etc., etc. But when you zoom in to the micro level, there is an economy there. You will find shops, you will find snack bars, you will find midwives, you will find teachers. There is an ecology that has emerged there, and you need to understand how that ecology actually operates. There have been some highly funded projects in Kibera to try to actually take people out of Kibera and give them new housing projects. Now, of course, there's been a lot of political reasons why that didn't work, but part of the processes that happened and then part of the resistance to it was because actually you were destroying this ecology. You were taking people out of a habitat that seems, horrible, and yet, this is their home. This is where they work, so someone might work as a midwife within this place. Someone might have a stall there. It is part of their everyday living, and actually they would have to pay a price to move out, even that if that means that they'll have an actual apartment or whatever it is. So really understanding what happens on the ground is a very important element if you want to understand the dynamics and where resistance is coming from, where potential is coming from. Of course, the tragic refugee crisis that we've seen in Europe a couple of years ago, through that process of this huge movement of people, you also had markets emerging. You had different services that were beginning to emerge. You had supply chains, you have resource distribution. All of these existed within these informal elements, and there are certain dynamics and propensities in the development of these markets, and if we know how they work, we can anticipate where they're going to go. And that is the key element, because complexity theories don't tell you what's going to happen. They do give you insight into how things are going to happen. So really about how reality is going to unfold. So specifically, we're kind of moving from a look at complexity as this kind of place where strange individuals meet to negotiate supply and demand into a network of people who are constantly trading and transacting. And what is interesting when you kind of see how networks are developed, human networks are not developed only to share resources in this transactional manner. Networks emerge, first of all, socially. You need to know a guy, right? You need to connect to the niece of your brother's wife or whatever to get somewhere. All of our economic connections, to a large extent, are built on social interaction first. We build these networks. And this is the way we kind of evolved as humans, because humans are social organisms and we operate in networks. And, you know, there are certain levels, there are certain propensities, there are certain dynamics that will repeat themselves in any network, in the development of any social network. So for example, if you wanted to hire me for something, you would first have a chat with me, right? We would have coffee. You would try to assess who I am as a person. You might go to offer and ask about me and gossip about me, right? Gossip is a very important mechanism for how human networks develop, because if we are all about collaborative networks, there is a risk involved, and you need to have information about the people that you can actually trust, whether you're hunting mammals or building buildings. That is all part of the process. So all the networks that you see emerging as markets are also social connections. So there is a huge overlap between social transactions and economic transactions. Across these networks, you will then see resource flows. There is a preferential attachment structure to all of these networks. We will always prefer to connect with people with more connections than ourselves. Over time, you will see hubs emerging in all of these networks. And of course, the closer you are to a hub, the more access you have to resource flows within that network. All networks, all markets will develop certain trust mechanisms, and you need to understand how these trust mechanisms work. So it might be formal legal structures, or it might be religious structures, or it might be other peer pressure elements, but you will have trust mechanisms and you can analyze and look for them. There will be risk management involved as well, of course, because we always take risk in these transactions. And these markets will continue to mutate, and that is the key element, because there are internal dynamics and propensities that will drive these markets forward. So just before we go into specific example of markets, the last element, when we really kind of dig deep into what is happening within the network at the local level, a few things that we know about how people operate. So first of all, people are position optimizers. As we said, the closer you are to resource flows, the closer you are to those hubs, the more opportunity you have to collaborate and have access to those resources, whatever it is that is flowing through your network. So people will always try to optimize their position and move into a better position, which is why they always think locally about how they can, you know, get a bit more access and get a bit of a better position within that network. They're also driven by near future calculations, and that relates back to the idea of non-rationality. It's not that they're irrational, but they're very focused on near future calculations. And in that case, they will be risk averse. So if for now I do have access to resources and I do have the right connections, I would be very reluctant to take a chance of getting away from that position. So that creates a lot of resistance in the system, even though you think that, if you just make a leap, you could get so much more. If you just change all of that element in your environment, you could get so much more, but people are not driven in that way. They will be focusing on near future calculations. The flip side of this is actually if they feel that they're stuck, if they feel that they're losing degrees of freedom within their network, if they feel that not only do they not have the right access to resource flows, but they cannot switch their positions in an effective way, they will actually take a much greater risk and take risks on completely disrupting their system, their network, in order to see what happens next. And I think that looking at some political economic phenomena like Brexit actually is very helped by understanding how these kind of elements were operating within certain networks in British society. But that's a different discussion altogether. Generally, there are certain propensities in how markets develop. And if we're aware of them, we can anticipate how things will unfold. So a couple of the main ones. First of all, markets will always move towards increased complexity, move towards creating hierarchies and specialization. And a good example is Somali pirates. So the Somali piracy phenomena actually emerged out of the fact that, fishermen living across the coast were basically pissed off by the idea that you had all of these foreign trawlers coming in and taking all the fish away while creating a lot of environmental damage. And of course, that was actually happening in an environment where you have a conflict in Somalia, and they weren't able, of course, to guard their waters. But it started off as this kind of resistance element of trying to scare these trawlers away. But then suddenly you have a mutation. You have a switch because suddenly there is an incentive, a resource that is being thrown into this ecology. You can actually get money from those ships that you were able to stop. And then suddenly you have an incentive, you have a new resource that is flowing into the system, and this is where this embryonic market begins to take shape. And once it takes shape, it will continue to evolve. So initially, it might just help the local villages and the local economy. So you start to see this economic activity happening in these little villages. But then, as I said, there is always a propensity to growth, expansion, and structuring within these markets. So the next stage is actually when you have angel investors coming in. Just like in any innovation, you have the local venture capitalists coming in, and they give these people money to buy better equipment, to do some training, and they take half of the loot. Now, this network allows specialization. You start to see structures building up. Of course, hierarchies and structures means that you start to see new power basis beginning to build within this market, and this network continues to evolve, and it continues to spread to insurance companies in London, right? It continues to relate to new services that are being introduced into this game. For example, the guys who actually take the briefcases full of money and having to deliver them to the pirates. So this is a new job, and you can make a lot of money doing that. So suddenly, again, a full ecology emerges around this idea of piracy that involves so many other players and so many other networks. And in terms of resource flows, you have a lot more resources flowing and filling this network. Now, this is not about, a moral tale of, shouldn't we have helped them with the whole fishing challenge that they were facing. It's not about that. Actually, perhaps having Somali pirates is something that works for you. Maybe it keeps certain other players within your field of operation occupied or disrupted or whatever it is. It is not about what this is as a phenomenon. It is not about fixing the world. It is about what does that mean as an emergence in your field of operation. But once you identify, and Offer was talking yesterday about the importance of not identifying a problem, but identifying an emergence. So if you see this emerging, what does it mean for you? Is it a threat? Is it a potential? And how are you actually going to use that? And it's not just identifying the emergence, but it is actually identifying the fact that this emergence will continue to evolve, and you can anticipate to a large extent how this market will continue to emerge, because you know that as long as there are no counter forces, it will move into hierarchies, specialization, power centers, etc., etc. And this is why understanding the inner propensities of economics is so important. Similarly, just as all of these networks will expand over time, there are other global networks that will inevitably reach out to those regions as well. 15% of the global economy is illegal. So everything from trafficking, drugs, materials, 15, it's quite a lot. Actually, economists have even started to factor that into national GDPs, because it makes sense. It makes them higher. It shows, a lot of success. But that's a different story. But all of these networks operate in certain ways. We know how they operate, and we know the kind of conditions that will allow them to thrive. So you will know to anticipate that these networks will go into your area of operation at some point. And again, if it is the propensity, the anticipation, what do you actually do with that? When you think about ivory and how ivory is being created from the poaching to the distribution, you understand the different players along the way that play part of that. When you think of counterfeit goods, when you think about, of course, drugs, trafficking of people, all of these are networks that will, if they're not already, will flow into certain areas once you disrupt them and once you create the right conditions for it. And many times these are secondary effects to military operations that might be doing some really good job in dealing with one thing, but these are the next sets of emergencies that might create problems for you. And part of that is also thinking about, when you analyze environments, a lot of it is about, okay, so who should we be thinking about, and who is on our side and who is on the fence, on who is completely contained. But as these environments evolve, suddenly new incentive structures emerge within them, making certain players that you thought were on the fence actually having some really vested incentives now to work against you. So understanding those dynamics and those propensities, again, is really important. Another element that is, of course, more unique in conflict economies is that you have a new type of play that you can do. Rather than just production and distribution, you can also appropriate things, meaning you can just take over stuff, and you can just take over resources, and that creates a whole new logic to how players will operate within that realm. First of all, they will need to make a choice in terms of production or appropriation, in terms of different resource flows. And the other element is that they will always need to invest more in terms of deterrence from other people taking their stuff. And in that sense, you will have a lot more collaboration across the networks between political elements and, local security elements and the economic transactions, which is where we see so much of the merging between economics and different political activities. And again, going back to James's talk yesterday about behavioral analytics and understanding the actual incentives, again, differentiating between what is the incentive behind taking certain action. Is it because it's ideologically or politically driven, or is it because that's their job and, it's nothing personal, as they say. Understanding those dynamics is extremely important. So generally, I would summarize and say that there are 4 main elements through which you can actually start to utilize these kind of complexity analysis. First of all, in terms of your analysis as well, it kind of adds a topographical dimension to how you can understand the environment into which you go into and operate. So it gives you a way to identify the wider scope, testing the wider waters in which you are going to swim that is beyond, a focus on the rival, etc., etc. It is actually, if you like, it is a widening of our understanding of what the rival actually is and what the challenges on the ground are. Second one is anticipation. So when you actually start to design and think about different ways of impacting your environment, it helps you actually identify secondary impacts. And these secondary impacts actually could work wonders for you. It just creates this wonderful downhill stream that will help you get to where you want, or it will create the next set of challenges that you should be aware of. So I think it is a great anticipative tool. The third element is actually you could create effects by intervening within the economic networks themselves. So actually working to manipulate those markets by disrupting different elements within the flows of resources, within the flows of information, within even destabilizing trust mechanisms or introducing alternative trust mechanisms into these environments in a way that will create those effects. And I think that is also being talked about yesterday about how the future environment of warfare is so much more complex and nuanced, and using a multitude of tools and a multitude of kind of small interventions that can create effects. And this is part of a kind of wider concept I've been working on for the last couple of years, which is called social acupuncture. So this is just the economic side of it, but I'm actually focusing on how you integrate economics, politics, technology, and culture to actually get an understanding of these networks that allows you through small, kind of very pinpointed, accumulated interventions to disrupt certain systems and change the dynamics. Because remember, from a complexity perspective, if the whole focus is on this recreation process between the micro and the macro, disrupt the processes in between and you will change the outcomes of those systems and nudge them in many different interesting directions. So you can actually use economics and those markets as the kind of objective of your strategy, of course, depending on a lot of other elements. But if there can only be one, this could also be the one. And the last one is monitoring. You can actually, we talked about emergence, but how do you know? We need to develop and design actual new tools for noticing emergences. And so many of the wider threats that emerge over time can be more easily detected if you notice shifts in the economic well-being and the emergence of new markets on the ground. I think that is probably one of the first elements that begin to shift that later on escalate and come together into other political phenomena. So really developing those tools that allow you to monitor and really detect early signals of shifts within these environments is a whole new realm in which you can play with. Of course, these can also have huge potential for modeling and mixing of analysis and design with some interesting data tools. And I think that it is these kind of tools that will serve the designers of the future, both in terms of signals, in terms of seeing what potential emergences are happening around them, and also in terms of giving them a whole new kind of play materials or a box of charons to figure out and find the right kind of approaches to deal with those. So that's really all it's about. It is about not just taking complexity as something that you need to deal with, but actually taking advantage of what happens within the complex space to promote whatever agenda that you're trying to promote. That's it. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
So do you have questions, or shall I bombard Orit with mine?
So one of the things, when we're looking at this as a tool, potentially, you talked about data as a design tool, particularly around threat emergence. How can we use this to either identify the potential velocity or speed of these markets, these new organic structure, the speed at which they're going to form? Because to some extent that determines our prioritization of how we respond.
That's true. So again, you can't predict, but you can see how shifts are happening within those networks. And you can actually analyze if there are any counter forces that would undermine those networks, or you see a kind of clear space for them to continue. You can also identify new connections that are happening within that network, and if you're able to follow the speed through which these connections are being made, then you would have a better understanding of the propensity and the speed. So it goes on two things. First of all, identifying the emergence itself, or in other elements is actually identifying the collapse of existing markets. So many times you would be able to identify existing markets within the environment that kind of seem to be working well, but you now identify signals that there is something happening there that is disrupting these markets. So it means that these people are going to have to move to find better positions, and the question is what is available for them, because they will do it. So it's following both the collapse and disruption of existing markets and the emergence of new ones.
And in the age of hybrid threats and coming from larger players, not the smaller players, but what you were talking about, did you already apply your analysis on what we call today the hybrid threat, the hybrid environment so far?
What do you mean?
Seeing some emerging factors coming up, that something's going on in certain areas, which you could later on, for example, like Ukraine, into state crisis or something like that?
So personally, I haven't done that kind of research. I can theoretically assume that these things will emerge. It is about
social mobbing in London, which you were looking at.
Yeah, so you can see how these things start to emerge, and you can see how that might link, with other grievances and issues. You could also actually look from these outer global networks and see where they might move next. So, for example, in international drug trafficking, one of the shifts that is happening now is the movement to synthetics. And if you're moving into synthetics, that actually means that you don't need the old supply chains, because you don't need to, get the cocoa leaves and all of that. You can actually produce stuff. And actually, these production factories are moving into Europe rather than having to be, trafficked from outside. You can identify how that potentially will evolve and emerge as a market. So it goes from both ways. And of course, that will link up, because, for example, if you think about Hezbollah as a player, if you analyze Hezbollah as a system, then you start to see their position within resource flows, with counterfeit medication going into Africa, with other stuff flowing from South America, and you see how that whole network operates.
Thank you, Doctor. Fascinating. I'm certainly share your mind on these concepts. Getting back to effects, the four approaches: analysis, anticipation, effects, and monitoring. So in certainly complex adaptive systems, if we inject energy into the system to kind of change it toward a direction, sometimes that energy that is injected may have secondary and tertiary effects that may not be anticipated. Mm-hmm. So what are some ways to minimize the negative effects of that energy that you may inject into the economic system? Thank you.
So obviously, as you rightfully say, when you inject energy into a complex system, you can never create an end state. Right. It is all about disrupting current flows. Okay. So the things that you can disrupt are flows in information and resources and in behaviors. And this is why it is all about accumulative interventions. and a constant feedback of learning what the impact is. So
monitoring, I guess, right?
right, part of monitoring, and actually so you and this is one of the key elements of thought that I've also learned working with Ofra and Shimon, is that you disrupt the system, you see what happens, you go back, you think about the next phase. So it's all very iterative in that sense, and the main question is what changed.
Right. So I guess there's a time. So after you disrupt that system, how long does it take to do additional adaptations to circumvent that disruption?
So again, it's how long is a piece of string. It really depends on the context. You might end up, and again, this is the manifestation of your operation. You might have multiple interventions in multiple places, and you will start to see, do they change the flows in a similar way? Do they converge, or do they create tensions between them? So it's always monitoring for those indirect impacts, and at the end of the day, you will not be able to anticipate all of them because there is uncertainty in terms of how they play out. So even if something works really well in one place, you can't replicate it ever in a different setting.
Thank you.
Piggybacking on what you said, you talked about social acupuncture, which I've never heard of before.
I made it up.
Beautiful.
Yes. But we will propagate it, I'm sure. So you said, talking about the small pinpointed accumulated dimension. Can you go into more detail about social acupuncture?
Right. So again, if we take this idea further and understand that, or at least take the view that all social phenomena is network-based, then the idea is, how do you start intervening within the flow of those networks to create a change? Now, here I was focusing on the economic side, but we know, and we talked about it, it's also culture, it's also behavior, it's also technology. All of these create these kind of topographies that are part of this network structure. So it is about identifying and finding ways to disrupt these structures along the way. And it also goes back to Ofra and others that have mentioned François Julien and thinking from a Chinese strategic perspective. So part of the idea that if you accept that the world is complex, we didn't just discover it in the 21st century. It has always been complex, right? So the question is, where do we find inspiration of other civilizations or other communities that have actually taken a complexity approach? They might have, called it something completely different, but actually developed ways in which to better operate while assuming that the world is complex. And I think that the Chinese traditional thought is a very interesting example of that. And I kind of took that, again, just as inspiration. It's not, a literally translation of it. But when you think about medicinal arts are all about intervention in order to change a certain reality, right? You want to fix something. So looking at Chinese medicine, at least for me, provided a really interesting sort of inspiration, and studying acupuncture and studying how you actually intervene and create a lot of counter effects by intervening in one place, which is much easier to intervene rather than the core of the problem itself, could create those ongoing elements. But you can read more about it in Social Acupuncture Co. UK. So, and we can continue that discussion.
Any more questions? Well, I'll throw one at you. Orit and I, as you know, I encourage arguments. And we have been having this argument for at least 10 years. I'll reframe it now, or rephrase it now, between emergent design, or the way these complex networks, economic networks emerge, and deliberate design, which is, again, me being design purist, advocating how much we can, I don't even know to say mitigate or stop them or make these kind of systems ourselves in areas of conflict that we go to, but I encourage you to explain to everyone why I'm wrong.
Well, you are wrong because you cannot create markets. You cannot create any social phenomena. Once there is a seed, You can incentivize it through intentional design or destabilize it through intentional design. What you cannot do is actually create it. A completely different example is startup clusters. So every city in the world wants to have a great innovative startup cluster, right? And you had so much research and money poured into, so how do we get our own Silicon Valley, our own, Silicon Roundabout, the Tel Aviv style, whatever it is, because so many cities were willing to pay so much money to actually have that created. You can't create it. And actually where you had those startup clusters, they were never created. There was a seed that began to emerge, and then in many cases you do have intentional intervention to help, build that, going back to the gardeners kind of metaphors, to help sustain that, to inject more money, to make it easier in terms of, doing business, setting up companies, etc., etc. I don't think that you can intentionally design social phenomena of any kind. You can manipulate social phenomena, you can disrupt it, you can destroy it to a certain extent, not completely. And you can disrupt it, but I don't think you can intentionally design it.
Maybe someone else here can speak to it better than I. But I do recall kind of an anecdote around Afghanistan, where a particular commander sought to create a market for that would facilitate trade as a basis to to bring people together and to create stability. And in fact, it had the exact opposite effect, where the market actually, as I understand it, and again, and maybe someone else can speak to it, but actually became one of the largest centers for illicit trade, in weapons, in trafficking, and all sorts of illegal activities, drugs. And so, it served the exact opposite effect that was intended. And it was just, and again, I think as opposed to a complexity approach, that was obviously quite simplistic, But I guess, and I don't know if this is a question that you can address here, but I'd be very curious in terms of how you would take a complexity approach to understanding, as you put it, how reality might unfold in relation to particular disruptive technology over time. So again, this is really the open question for me as we kind of seek to wrap up these few days, but and you and I spoke about it earlier, where so much of what we've talked about seems to be kind of methods at getting at a clear understanding of an existing problem. And we've had a few people speak to strategic foresight as perhaps an additional methodology that we could incorporate in some way as a basis for looking at directions of change, as you put it, in terms of how things might unfold from an innovation perspective, to identify those challenges that we might seek to overcome in order to be anticipatory, so that we're not always reacting. I can appreciate that the great challenge first and foremost is overcoming and better understanding the problems that we currently face. And where there's so many challenges there, but from an innovation perspective, you don't simply want to be addressing those challenges, right? So anyway, I welcome your thoughts.
So absolutely. So first of all, in terms of the Afghanistan example, it's very important because this is not about let's go and do development work. It's not about that. It's not about let's go and create markets and then everything will be all right. Because actually when you create markets, you create new resource flows and it could create, a whole new range of conditions and it really depends on who gets access to those resources. So it's not about that. It is about thinking how and what kind of market development could work for you rather than against you. It's also about the anticipation that once you have created the infrastructure for a network, then other goods will flow through that system as well. In terms of technologies, again, remember that technologies are not actual products and services. They can be turned into products and services. So it is only when you start to think about how they will be turned into new products and services and change competition and change distribution of resources that you can start to see how that plays out. So it is about how they will form, and there you can analyze and anticipate different ways of formation. So take, for example, cultured meat. Cultured meat is an amazing new technology. It hasn't been introduced into the market yet, but we know it's going to have a huge impact. But it will be a very different type of impact if it is introduced into the market in a way that will create monopoly. So you'll have a couple of very big international corporations that actually hold all the IP and you know, are there to kind of concentrate the distribution of cultured meat, or it will be distributed as open source technology, and you will see a lot of startups and you will see a lot of people actually doing kind of DIY, grow your own steak you know, in that kind of setting, and that will create a completely different network and distribution system and flows of resources, and the amount of people that will be involved in that network will be completely different. So these are the kind of things that you can actually simulate and play with in order to understand how certain technologies will come through. So, you know, technologies seem to be really hyped, and there's a lot of things about, you know, how AI is going to either emancipate us or kill us or whatever. You know, these are really, really simplistic. It is about playing with, so what does that actually change? And so much about, you know, innovation and the hype of even new companies and startups is because we don't really understand how they will impact the network. And a lot of it is old style economics and old side products that are just being redelivered in a new form. But they're not a really game changer in terms of the network structure of it. And others are. So it is about differentiating between those elements and trying to simulate.